Hello, everybody. Welcome to our event tonight with Elizabeth Wetmore. We welcome you from Book Passage. We are a little store in Marin that prides itself on bringing together authors and readers since 1976. That's 45 years of togetherness. My name is Julie Carlucci, and I head up the Sign First Editions Club for the store. If you want more information about it, just go to our website. And a special shout out to all of our members from all over the world. I am so honored tonight to be hosting and in conversation with Beth. Her book, Valentine, was our April 2020 first edition pick, and we were so excited about it. And we had an event planned, but we all know what happened about a year ago with the lockdown. And so now we are happy to have her back and happy to announce that it's out in paperback. This is a book sale. This arc was very treasured. Everybody kept passing around and fighting for it. And it really was a bookseller, indie bookseller favorite because it had such rich development of characters' inner lives, had a creative narrative structure. It's a literary masterpiece. It's a compelling, fast-paced drama that draws you in and quickly attaches you to a story, and you learn more about your own perspective and enlarge your sense of hope. And Elizabeth and her kaleidoscope of life experiences has really led her up to become an amazing storyteller. She has done everything. When I read about it, from tending bars to painting cooling towers at a petrochemical plant. And I think the most interesting one is the one where you were a classical music announcer from a one-bedroom cabin in the woods. I mean, a lot of different life experiences. She has been, she's a recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts, 2 fellowships from the Illinois Arts Council, and a grant from the Barbara Deming Foundation. But I think the one that is really standout and just like really is a testament to how amazing this book is, you debuted on the New York Times bestseller list at number 2 during a time period where there was no book tour, no publicity, stores weren't even open, and despite this, you land on the bestseller list. And so, I mean, this book is that good. So I am going, there's so much to say about this book. I am going to let Elizabeth set it up for you, give you a flavor of the book by a couple readings, and then we'll dive into questions and conversation. I have so many things to ask.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be with y'all tonight. Julie, thank you for that amazing introduction. And I also want to thank Louisa Smith. Louisa, I hope you've made it in. Louisa, I can't remember if you were the first person who saw the arc and reported, that you loved it back to some of the folks at Harper, or if you were just one of the first people, but you have been an absolute champion of Valentine. And I'm incredibly grateful to you and to you, Julie, and to all of you at Book Passage for your support of the book. I hear it was quite an odyssey getting the books out to everyone. So thank y'all. For those of you who have already bought the book or recommended it to friends and family, thank you. Your support has meant a lot to me and to my family. And I guess I should say too, that we're on the occasion of the paperback coming out. So, so if you, if you need to save a buck or want to save a buck, you can pick it up in paperback now. So anyway, so I guess I'll just start with what people call the elevator pitch, although, just a few sentences to describe Valentine. Although lately I've been thinking about something Jeanette Winterson once said about her books. She said that the book is its own description. If I could truly describe it, I needn't have written the book. And I think of that often because it's so hard to sort of synthesize, things into just kind of a few lines. But in short, Valentine is set in 1976 in the oil patch city of Odessa, Texas, which is my hometown. And it explores the aftermath of a vicious crime against a Mexican-American girl, a 14-year-old Mexican-American girl, and the effects of the crime on her and her family, as well as the other women and girls in town. I use alternating points of view, 6 characters, among them a 10-year-old little girl whose mother has left town without her, Deborah Ann Pierce, a 26-year-old mother with a 9-year-old daughter and another child on the way, Mary Rose Whitehead, and an old woman who is grieving her husband who's recently died, and sort of has made up her mind that she's made all the big decisions she's going to make in her life, and that the world really has nothing more, for her. She has nothing to offer the world. And so as the book opens, Corrine Shepherd is mostly just sort of smoking and drinking herself into the sweet hereafter. And then, of course, the teenage girl, Glory Ramirez, my hero in the book, who's struggling to not let this one terrible moment sort of define the rest of her life. As I said, the book is set in Odessa. It's an oil and gas rich town in the vast Permian Basin, which is at the southern end of the Llano Estacado. It's all natural gas and oil, a few little cattle, maybe a little cotton or sorghum, although, the climate crisis is actually affecting how many cattle and how, crops you can grow. And in the last 10 years, there's been an enormous oil boom. It has the greatest oil and gas deposits on the planet, actually. And so with fracking and horizontal drilling, it's been producing more than ever before, until the pandemic hit. And so, of course, that drilling has consequences, not only for the people who live in my hometown, but all of us. It has an enormous impact on the environment, and most particularly for the people who live there. So that's just a little bit about the book. I think I'll just read from the book for a bit, and just so you can kind of get a sense of the voice. And I don't think this needs a whole lot of setup, but I will say, I think this section is pretty contained. But I will say that in this scene, Glory Ramirez and her uncle Victor are leaving Texas, maybe forever, and they're heading toward Mexico. They've had a bit of car trouble and are back on the road. And this is a bit of a sad moment in the book, especially for her uncle Victor, because he earned his citizenship by serving his country in Vietnam. So this is kind of a poignant moment for him. There's a brief mention in this section of a character from an earlier chapter, Tina, but I think it's easy enough to move through without a whole lot of explanation. And then the only other thing you need to know is that there's a racist slur in the text here. It's a line of dialogue in the mouth of a character who would say such a thing. And it's a word that I don't have the right to speak or want to. I knew when I typed it that I would never read it aloud. It's not mine to say. So when I come to this word in the text, I'll just pause for a few seconds, and we can kind of, just linger in that silence together and consider this marvelous character, Victor, and the racism he encounters on the day he returns to his hometown after having served his country and survived a war. So without any further ado, Glory and Victor won't make it to Del Rio in time for sunset. When she returns to the El Camino, her uncle has removed the fuel filter and sprayed it down with Kim Tool. While they wait for the filter to dry, they sit on the hood watching the sun go down and listening as the coyotes get revved up for the night. The harvest moon, when it rises, is blood red and beautiful against the darkening sky. Try floating with your ears under the water, Tina had said to Glory as they drifted across the swimming pool that afternoon. Listen for long enough, she said, and the sounds from the highway will blend together. A truck hauling pipeline or water, a flatbed turning onto the highway, the crank of a pump jack slowly winding itself up, they will all start to sound alike. You can tell yourself you're hearing anything, Tina said, her large white arms floating next to her like buoys. And when you look at that sky, it's a wonder, a damned wonder. On the other side of Comstock, they cut south to State Highway 277 and drive along the border through Juneau and Del Rio. At Eagle Pass, the road to El Indio turns to gravel and then dirt, and the border pulls them closer. Victor drives quietly, keeping an eye out for a cop's flashing lights in the rearview mirror, occasionally glancing at his niece in the passenger seat. Is she okay? This child who has never been more than 50 miles from the town where she was born. Are you okay? He asks. Fine. Glory rolls her eyes and smacks her gum and blows a bubble as big as her face. But next time, go out there and get your own damn stick. He smiles and keeps his eyes on the road ahead, lightly scanning the narrow shoulders for armadillos and coyotes, maybe the occasional bobcat. A set of headlights appears on the horizon and he watches it grow brighter and larger as it draws near. When a cop passes them, Victor looks in his rearview mirror to see if the car has pulled onto the shoulder and begun to turn around. Victor won't be coming back to this beautiful place, Texas. For him, it is a diseased limb to be quickly removed before the rot reaches his heart, something he had managed to forget in the years after coming home from Vietnam and finding work and keeping an eye on Alma and Glory. Although, he muses now, his homecoming from Southeast Asia should have been a good reminder. He had stepped off a Greyhound bus in downtown Odessa expecting to be met by his sister and instead came face to face with his old boss from the gas station. The man wore his work overalls and a shell cap, and to Victor, it seemed like no time at all had passed while he was overseas. Old Kirby Lee hadn't changed a bit. On seeing the younger man, he pulled Victor into a big bear hug, his icy blue eyes flashing with pleasure. Well, shit, Ramirez, you lucky. Looks like you'll live to drink another Tecate or three. And there was Victor, breathing in the scent of gasoline on the man's gray overalls, hugging his old boss back tight, so tight the man began to squirm in his arms. And all the while Victor was thinking, he don't mean anything by it. He don't mean it. He don't mean it. I made it home alive. Victor drives on, the lump in his throat large enough to insist on silence. He is thinking about a summer when he picked grapes in Northern California. His fingers bled every night and the hours were long, but he loved the country and the woman who drove him into the city one Sunday to eat chocolate at the pier and walk through the park at dusk. He will miss thinking that he might run into her again sometime. He will miss movie theaters and Bluebell ice cream and brisket. He will miss a steady paycheck and the sun setting over the sandhills and Monahans, and he will miss hearing the odd, ugly cries of the cranes when he is sitting on the bank of the skinny and shallow Pecos River, a cold beer in one hand, his bird book in the other. The birds in Mexico will be more or less the same, but the river will be different. He will miss it. Why don't you tell me one of your war stories? Glory looks worried, and for an instant, Victor wonders if he has been talking out loud. Maybe in a little while, he tells her. Are we still in Texas? She asks when they drive through El Indio, a village without a stoplight, gas station, or a single sign written in English. Yes, Victor nods. This is Texas. Tell me a story about Texas, she says, or Mexico. There are a dozen stories Victor could tell his niece, so many, but tonight he can think only of the sad ones. Ancestors hanged from posts in downtown Brownsville, their wives and children fleeing to Matamoros to spend the rest of their lives looking across the river at land that had been in their families for 6 generations. Texas Rangers shooting Mexican farmers in the backs as the men harvested sugarcane, or tying men to mesquite trees and setting them on fire, or forcing broken beer bottles down their throats. They did it for fun, Victor could tell her. They did it on a bet. They did it because they were drunk, or they hated Mexicans, or they heard a rumor that the Mexicans were teaming up with some freedmen or what was left of the Comanche, and they were all coming for the white settlers' land, their wives and their daughters. And maybe sometimes they did it because they knew they were guilty, and having already traveled so far down the path of their own iniquity, they figured they might as well see it through. But mostly, they did it because they could. Rio Bravo, Victor's Papi had called it, furious river, river of villains and desperados, and Papi hadn't meant him and his. He meant whatever lost souls lynched hundreds of men and a few women in the years between 1910 and 1920. He meant the Texas Rangers who in the summer of 1956 loaded 2 of Victor's uncles onto a cattle car along with 20 other men and dropped them off in the Sierra Madres with a single jug of water and a one-liner. Y'all fight it out amongst yourselves, boys. Look in any ravine within 50 miles of the border, Victor could tell his niece, in any small wash or depression. Look under any skinny mesquite that might bring some small relief from the hot sun, and you will find us there. You could build a house with the skeletons of our ancestors, a cathedral from our bones and skulls. Instead, he tells her about her mother's village and how the sea is so crowded with red snapper they jump into the fishing boats just to get a little elbow room. Unimpressed, Gloria again pops her gum and blows a bubble so large that when it eventually pops, she has to peel it off her face. Tell me a good story, she says. An opossum meanders off the shoulder and steps in front of the car. Victor taps the brake and swerves gently, relieved not to feel the thud beneath his tire. Okay, he says, here's one that my abuela used to tell us kids. I'll take you to her gravesite when we get to Puerto Angel. It's a sad story, he warns. Is it a Texas story? Yes. Then tell it. I'll stop there.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth. The writing and the way that you set up the setting, I can feel like when, you know, when they were getting gas and what you hear, what you see, that was one of the things that really stood out for me in the book was the landscape and the surroundings played such a big part. I could feel like in the opening scene when after she's attacked, you feel the dust and the grit, and you feel like when she shows up on Mary Rose's porch, I could feel it so it was so real because of the way you had presented it and served it to the reader. It's really amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, the land was really important to me in this book. This book was pretty personal to me, and it took me a long time to write it. It took me a long time to be able to write it. And part of it, a lot of it had to do with having very mixed feelings about my hometown and the culture there, and the oil and gas industry, and the environmental depredations. And also just, you know, I think part of it just had to do with being a young woman who left home as soon as she could, you know, and like a lot of young people, I've never looked back, you know, although I had family there and always went back to visit. But when I began thinking about writing this book, I knew that I had to access a certain amount of love and open-heartedness, you know, to be able to really engage these characters in this place and these stories in the way that they deserved. And that was not easy for me. So the way I got my foot in the door of that actually was by borrowing my sister's pickup truck when I would go home for visits and packing a lunch and just spending hours driving around out in the desert and out in the oil patch. And over the years, I really fell back in love with that land. You know, once you get past the oil derricks and the rigs and into the Great Chihuahuan Desert, it's very beautiful. It's very sparse. It's very, you know, stark, but it's very beautiful. And for me, that was kind of my foot in the door. And I think so I think you see that love of the landscape, you know, all through the book. So
You know, it really shines. It's just beautiful. I could even smell it. It was just so real. When I think back on, because every bookseller at the store that read the ARC, it was a very passionate response, and I think almost all of them were female. But it was a very strong response because I feel like everyone has their own, can relate to that universal struggle and that vulnerability that women have to confront, you know, one way or another to survive in sometimes pretty toxic cultures and environments, and violence against women. But what I think everybody just was cheering for was, I don't want to do any spoilers, but just the idea that, you know, if we come together, we can help each other, and there's healing and there's strength in that. And I think your story so beautifully reminds us of, it doesn't have to be gender, it can be anything. It can be anything where you feel othered.
Mhm.
but that power of human connection and community is so important. It really shines in your story. But one question I have: what was the impetus that nudged you to write about female oppression?
You know, it's hard to know exactly what the genesis was. In a lot of ways, I think this book began with the voices before anything else. You know, and specifically the voices of these characters. You know, I've talked about this elsewhere, so if people have heard this, sorry, so I'm repeating myself. You know, I was a prodigious reader and a pretty maudlin kid, and a pretty, you know, a kid sort of at odds with my world, as a lot of people are, you know, who become writers, I guess. But in addition to reading, I spent a lot of time sort of creeping around, listening in on adult conversations, and specifically the conversations of my mother's and her girlfriends, just by way of an absolute sort of accident, or good fortune, however you want to look at it. There were several years where the street where I grew up, there were no little boys at all on the street. And Larkspur Lane is very much sort of lifted from the street where I grew up. I made some changes, of course, but I was really mining my memory to sort of set up Larkspur Lane. And so I spent a lot of my girlhood, you know, of course, the men all went off to work in the oil patch, and a lot of the mothers did too. You know, this is a very working class neighborhood, so a lot of women worked outside the home. But as a little girl, I was often surrounded by other little girls and old women. And I spent a lot of time listening, and I think those voices really stuck with me. But then, of course, you know, in the way of these things, I mean, voices aren't a story. So when I started doing a little digging and research into my hometown, Odessa was very segregated when I grew up there, in the 70s. And in very short order, I came to realize that there was a lot I didn't see in my hometown, you know. And so as I began doing research and reading old newspapers, one of the things that came into very sharp focus to me were, just going back for decades, the preponderance of violence against women and girls, and in particular sexual violence, and how that really increased when there was an oil boom. You know, the crime statistics just shot through the roof during an oil boom, because people were coming from all over the place to make a lot of money, you know, a lot of young men. The other thing that really stuck out to me was how much worse it was for women and girls of color, you know. And so I kind of had that in my mind as I sort of sat down and started to write the book. So.
And then when did you, I know I read someplace that you started with, like you were a short story writer, and you started with, was it Deborah Ann and Corinne?
Yeah, I actually, yeah, there are a couple of chapters. Jenny's chapter, Deborah Ann's mom's chapter, was a short story actually that came out in the Baltimore Review. And then Mary Rose's first chapter was also a short story. And I had it's the form I'm most comfortable with. And I think you see that residue just all over this book. You know, so many of these chapters could really stand alone. It's an odd little book, you know, in a lot of ways. So Corinne came actually much later. She was a minor character through many drafts, and she was actually the biggest surprise in the book for me, that she became a major character. So, but yeah, I had imagined this as a collection of short stories. So.
And then what was the nut that pulled it all together? Like what was the thing that you wanted to say to break through, you know, human consciousness? Like what was it through the story that you want to transmit to the reader?
I mean, I think there were a lot of things that I hope to do with the book. And of course, you're never thinking of these things in the early drafts, you know. But you know, on some level, I mean, I wanted very much to call attention to this part of the world that a lot of people don't know a lot about, you know, or didn't, and, you know, aren't terribly familiar with, but that has such an enormous impact on, you know, our environment, our economy, you know, global relations. And yet I think a lot of people don't know much about it. And I wanted to call some attention to that. You know, West Texas has been kind of 110-year sort of slow rolling environmental disaster. You know, for example, I was just reading an article in the Texas Observer the other day about the thousands of uncapped abandoned gas and oil wells all across the Permian Basin that are leaking methane gas, and have been, some of them since the 1980s, you know, and because there's so little regulation of the oil and gas industry, and because Odessa and the Permian Basin are so geographically isolated, a lot of people don't even know about it, you know. So I wanted to call some attention to that. And I also wanted to attempt as best I could to reckon with some of the racism that I saw as a child growing up there, and you know, and to try to reckon with that as a white woman who was well acquainted with casual racism and the complications of growing up surrounded by casual racism, and you know, and hearing some of the people you most love in the world and most admire, right? People who are otherwise, you know, devoted parents or devoted teachers, you know, hard workers, you know, Christians, and yet, right, you know, they continue to harbor this poison, you know, of racism, and you know, the sin of racism, really. So I wanted to try to grapple with that. I was interested with each of the characters. I was interested in something different. You know, I wanted to kind of explore Corinne's grief, you know, and Mary Rose's anger. You know, I thought a lot about in the book and in general, you know, in my writing, I think a lot about reconciliation and forgiveness and mercy, you know, and you know, the importance of asking for it. You know, and how so many of the characters in this book, you know, need to ask for forgiveness in a lot of ways, and are not always able to do so. And I was interested in you know, Marilyn Robinson is one of my heroes, and she was on my thesis committee as a grad student. And you know, I admire her work, but she was personally very important to me, in the sense that she was really one of the first writers who I worked with who really encouraged me to sort of think of my characters and my stories as about something more than survival, you know. And so I'm also very interested in the kind of enduring sort of the resilience of the human spirit, you know, these women and girls who don't have a lot of money, you know, they don't have a lot of education. Several of them didn't graduate from high school, you know, they don't have a lot of power. And yet they find ways to act so much more courageously than they might think they're capable of. They find ways to survive. They find ways to hold each other up, and to hold up their children and their daughters, you know. And so I was interested in that as well, you know, the kind of just the, you know, the nobility of the person, I guess, you know.
Well, they are warriors. I mean, it really, you know, each in their own way, find a way to survive and thrive, given all the roadblocks that they have been given. One of the things I thought was interesting was this idea of, I mean, Corinne really brought it. I mean, her character really surfaced it, but how she felt so whole as a teacher. She felt complete. And then when, you know, she had to make the choice of having a child, and that was taken away from her. I hope I'm not doing any spoilers. Then that, you know, that kind of changed everything. And, you know, a lot of the women seem to have hopes and dreams, but then the childhood, the childbearing question comes into play, and that changes things. And that is something very gender specific. I mean, but yeah, talk about that, like, because I saw it come up with a couple characters.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the scenes that comes to my mind most clearly is the scene where Mary Rose takes her daughter, you know, and tells a little white lie to her husband so that they can drive, you know, 350 miles to Albuquerque so she can get an abortion, because she's pregnant with her second child and doesn't want to be, And when I wrote that chapter, I worked on this book for a long time. So when I wrote that chapter, probably nearly a decade ago, and handed it off to girlfriends and readers to take a look at, several of my girlfriends were like, "You're going to have to explain this. This is set in 1976. This is this is post Roe v. Wade, and you're going to have to explain this to readers, particularly contemporary readers." And I said, I'm not explaining this. It'll mess up I just didn't want to screw with the story. And these characters, I'm deep in these characters' point of view, so I'm always mindful of how much insight they would have. If you went into my hometown today, and you needed to access that kind of health care, you would have to drive about 350 miles to get services. So so those problems remain, and to this day. So I think of the character of Carla, the 17-year-old waitress who is a new mom, who couldn't get 350 miles away from her life, by virtue of not having a dependable car and money, or just being able to disappear for a couple of days from your life. And so I thought a lot in this book about the way, controlling your motherhood, and your fertility, and making those choices can really affect, the way a young girl sort of thinks of herself and her possibilities and her future, so. Yeah.
It was very, it just reminds you, that's because you live in a major city, I live near, in a major city, but you forget that that is the reality for so many.
Mhm.
So that,
Right. Yeah.
uh,
And I think, and I had similar things in mind when I was hoping to sort of shine a light on the way these women deal with harassment, and so forth. I think, like a lot of women, I was incredibly grateful to see Me Too happen, but I also became very aware very quickly that not all, but a lot of the women who were able to speak out, in the Me Too movement were women who, in general, and painting, broad strokes, but in general, they were well educated. They had support. They had money. They had options. And it was still right. And these were nearly untenable positions. But I was very interested in a woman who endures sexual harassment, and the way she deals with it, may not only determine her safety, right, but will determine whether or not she gets more shifts so she can pay her bills. Right.
right,
And the way that the kind of whisper network of women to help each other sort of navigate that terrain, so.
well, a lot of ways, like if you think about the Me Too movement and how the celebrities kind of bonded together, like you see, like there was so much fear when they talk now about what they had to do and like meet in secret, and a lot of them didn't want to come forward, and that fear, it's real,
Right.
and it happens in many different industries, on many different levels, many different socioeconomic um, communities, and it's a real, in a way, like when we talk about the war, there's
Mhm.
there's a form of war there, just
Mhm.
fighting that oppression.
Mhm.
um One thing I wanted to ask you is, why do you think, okay, so with Mary, I mean, all your characters are so fascinating. I could have like a 5-hour conversation with you about every single character and their backstory, and because they're so rich. But with Mary Rose, why she, she brought the question, why is it so hard, do you think, for people to speak against the status quo?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, Mary Rose is such an interesting character to me because I think she's a little less heroic than some of the readers I've had. I mean, on the one hand, she opens the door. I mean, the thing that, depending on your sort of religious background, is something that people are commanded to do, right? To welcome the stranger, particularly an injured stranger. So on the one hand, she opens that door. I mean, I think you could make a pretty cogent argument that that's like the bare minimum. But she's this one young woman. She's 26. She's got a 9-year-old daughter. She was kicked out of high school the minute she started showing. She's a cattle rancher's wife. She has spent her life steeped you know, and the casual racism that was common to the time and the place. And she does not see anything in herself that would suggest that she would have the ability, you know, or even in a lot of ways the desire to sort of speak out, you know, against a young white roughneck, you know, and possibly alienate, you know, her friends and her neighbors and her church. But you know, but there's something that was very clear to me when I was writing that chapter, and that is that, you know, her conscience is shocked, you know, and it's like a big, you know, it's like a swift kick to the head, that moment when she sees that little girl, and then more specifically when she has to confront, you know, the person, you know, who attacked her, you know, minutes later, right? You know, her conscience is shocked, and that changes her, you know. And she's angry, right? And she's pretty naive in this book too, you know. I joke to friends that, you know, I think she might have been the only character, you know, who thought things would turn out different, who seemed to seriously think things would turn out differently, right, you know, than they did. I'm trying not to give away too many spoilers.
Right.
Like I keep catching myself and think, oh, you know. But yeah, you know, her conscience was shocked, and I'm interested in that, you know. I think you know, it's interesting to me. I mean, my conscience was shocked a few years ago, you know, when I was down in Texas visiting family, when the story began breaking about the families being separated at the border, you know. You know, and there's nothing new about what was going on at the border then, right? That, you know, that you know, depend, you know, just administration to administration, you know, how awful are we going to be to our neighbors to the south, you know? But there was something in that particular, you know, action that really just shook me to my core, you know. And I think that can change the way, you know, characters behave. I think it can change the way we behave, you know. So yeah.
Mhm. And I think in that scene, she also, it's early in the book, so I'm not spoiling anything, but
Mhm.
she also looks, her daughter is only 9 years old. Her
Mhm.
daughter is nine, like what, 5 year difference
Mhm.
between her daughter and Gloria.
Right.
So
It's so interesting to me. I try to always be mindful of the sort of the shortcomings of my white characters, you know, and I really tried to think carefully about some of my choices as a writer. You know, Mary Rose is very interesting because she looks and she thinks that, you know, this could have been her daughter, but she never really sees Glory, you know, sort of independently of that. You know, there's a moment pretty late in the book where Mary Rose, you know, behaves kind of badly, I think, in a lot of ways, where she sort of demands, right, that Glory's uncle sort of produce her, right, you know, that he make her do something, you know. And she never really is able to see this girl, you know, as a kind of, you know, without sort of contextualizing her, you know, against her own daughter. And I saw that a lot with a lot of the characters. To me, one of the most poignant moments in the book is, and again early, is when Potter Shepherd sees Glory at the Sonic, you know, about to get into this truck, and he wonders if he should intervene, right? And ultimately he doesn't, right? Because he can't see her clearly. You know, he thinks she's older. You know, we know, right? We know that white people do that. They look at, you know, they look at young Black men and they see them as larger or older, you know, than they are. And so in that moment, you know, this really well-intentioned old man, a sweet character. I mean, I love Potter Shepherd, but in that moment, right, his upbringing and his narrow vision of the world makes it impossible for him to see her clearly as a child, right? And so he doesn't intervene, you know. And so, you know,
right,
a lot of those kinds of missteps along the way, you know.
right. Which are
So
very human. It's
right.
very relatable. I mean, you can
Mhm.
see how that
Yeah.
would happen. One of my favorite characters was Deborah Ann. I just loved her. She just had a, you know, a vitality, a earnestness. What was your, what was your motive in putting her in? What did you want to show with her? Because there's so many characters. I mean, she's the youngest. I think she's 10.
Mhm.
But what did you want to bring to the story? Like, what does she represent?
Yeah. Well, first I should say that she was the easiest character for me in a lot of ways because I was about the same age as Deborah Ann Pierce in 1976. So I was really able to sort of mine some of my own memories of being a 10-year-old girl and in a place where you could kind of roam freely, in a time when you could roam freely, no, none of the adults were paying attention, we were like feral cats, but there were quite a few things I loved about her. I was the book is called Valentine, and I've talked about it as kind of a love letter to my hometown and a love letter to the people there. It's also a love letter to a few sort of organizations and entities that meant a lot to me. It's a love letter to books and the bookmobile, which Deborah Ann loves. It's a bit of a love letter to college radio, which saved my life as a young woman growing up in Odessa, Texas, and introduced me to punk, and I imagine has saved a lot of young people's lives. But I was also very interested in this little girl whose mother has left, and her longing to do justice for someone else, both as a way of just being kind, but also as a way of almost trying to earn, her mother's return. That seemed very real to me as a way that a little kid would think, that her mother had left town, but maybe if Deborah Ann did all these good deeds, right, somehow, she would be able to make her mother come back to town. And that was very moving to me and felt very real to the way, young kids think. And so I was really exploring that. And I was also, exploring the character of Deborah Ann as a character who has wonderful instincts about people and who follows those instincts, and sort of serves another person, with a kind of humility and grace that, a lot of the adults in the book are not quite, able to muster. So,
Mm,
you
yeah.
know.
it in a way she represents, to me it's like how everyone started. Everyone
Mhm.
started with that
Right.
eagerness, that innocence, and because of different life experiences,
Mhm.
some motivations get, you know, off the wrong track.
Right.
Um, what about Dale? Did what what is he? I mean, I think it's obvious what he represents, but
Mhm.
I guess like he's kind of like what's in the water, and like what do you see as what do we need to do to change that, to change
Mhm.
like it happens all the time,
Mhm.
from different,
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be a rape. It could,
Mhm.
there's millions of examples in our news of
Mhm.
just injustice.
Right. Yeah, I remember hearing Hillary Clinton some years back address the United Nations. It was like the Council on the Status of Women and Girls, and I remember very clearly a line that stuck out from her speech, where she talked about how strange it is that so many men and boys feel compelled to control, the bodies of women and girls. And I think that, in the same way that racism is sort of, white supremacy is sort of stitched into the fabric of this country, I think that kind of misogyny is also, stitched into the fabric. And I think, um, and in that part of the world, I think, it's sort of, underscored by, a fair amount of religious fundamentalism, and geographic isolation and whatnot. So, I don't know that I have a good answer for that. Dale was a hard character for me because I generally subscribe to the idea that, you have to have at least a little bit of love and compassion for all your characters, no matter how minor, and I really strive to do that as a writer, so much so that, if I can't muster a little bit of compassion for a character, no matter how, unlikable, and I loathe that. I wish we never had to talk about likable and unlikable characters again. But if I can't access at least a little bit of compassion and empathy for them, to me, that's a sign that something's really gone wrong with the writing or the story, and until I can get there, I might set it aside. but and I tried a couple of times with him, and then I just, I just know, I realized that that was not necessary, and that this character didn't deserve it. And I really didn't want him to be the focus of the book, by trying to redeem him in any shape, form, or fashion. There's one of my favorite lines in the book is kind of late in the book where the owner of a restaurant, upon hearing that something's happened to him, she says something along the lines of, well, wasn't the first time someone ran him over, probably won't be the last, and in a lot of ways, I mean, I was content to let his fate be, his punishment. I mean, this is not a man who's going to live very long. He's not going to have a good life. He's going to do a lot of damage on his way out, but in a lot of ways, his life is its own sort of punishment, and I was okay I was okay with sort of abandoning him to his fate, So although I badly wanted to exact revenge, so yeah. So, but
Well, there's an aspect of what he represents that is not redeeming. There's
mhm,
no compassion. I don't have compassion. I
right,
don't see reason for being. I
right,
just, it's just the underbelly of
right,
all the terrible things about, that in with our
right,
humanity, that we just need to continue to
right,
move forward and try to
right,
educate and try to
right,
get past. But
right. And in a lot of ways, I think part of the reason I let him sort of fade into the background that way, was because I very much wanted the book to be centered on the lives and the stories of these women and girls. And in a lot of ways, that wasn't their job or their work. There's a moment early in the book where, Glory's Uncle Victor says, listen, this is a war story, right? And he's not talking about the war he's just survived. He's talking about the war that his niece is living, right? This young woman who's been, the victim of this terrible attack. She is not a young woman with a lot of money. She's not going to get a lot of counseling in this time and place. She's really on her own to heal herself, and to allow the people in her family to help her heal. And one of them, disappears out of the book pretty early. Her mom is deported early in the book, so she's really, on her own out there. And so and at the same time, I mean, you asked earlier, like, what has to change? I mean, men have to change, right? I mean, this is their job. And those of us who are raising sons, of course, I mean, all of us have if we're raising sons, we have a job to do, but when you look at characters like Dale Strickland, I mean, it's their job to save their own souls in a lot of ways. And in the same way that, when you look at the issues of white supremacy in this country, I mean, the work to be done to, solve the issue of racism in America is not the job of Black folks, right? you know,
information's there. We have to go get it. We have to be
right,
hungry we have to want
right,
change and to
right,
go educate.
right.
Um, what about, okay, I know we have to wrap up soon, but I just had a quick question about
Oh,
Ginny, because you knew about Ginny and we didn't know much about Ginny,
mhm.
Deborah Ann's mom, like, which
Yeah.
I guess, well, I guess you, I don't want to ask what happens to her or what, but I kind of am curious because we
Yeah.
don't really,
There
we
are
don't really,
3 chapters in the book with 3 characters who get that one point of view chapter, and that's the only chapter they get. Jenny is one of them, Carla is one of them, and Suzanne.
Mhm.
Um, and I was very interested as a kind of structural choice in having these sort of singular voices sort of step forward once in the book and have this chapter that belonged to them, and their actions in that chapter have an enormous impact, on the other characters in the book, but they don't really come back again. To me, I mean, Jenny's chapter is probably the loneliest chapter in the book. I often have trouble reading parts of that chapter without getting a little verklempt. And you know, I was really interested in sort of exploring and meditating on the enormous loneliness of this young woman, you know, with a 10-year-old daughter, you know, again, a very young mother, who has made up her mind that, you know, she can't know her own heart and her own dreams, you know, in that place, right? I mean, you know, which seemed to me to be the kind of thing that a woman who became a mom at 16, right, you know, might encounter, you know. But she also knows that she can't take her daughter with her. And so the to me, the enormous loneliness of this young woman driving, you know, out of the state, right, without her daughter is just heart-wrenching. And again, you know, to me goes to this idea of women controlling their lives, right, and controlling their own stories by controlling their bodies, by being able to control their bodies, right, and what happens to them. And you know, and when they choose to become mothers, for example, you know, so yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I
I
don't
saw
know
that.
what happens to her. I kind of specifically left it at that, um, you know, because I felt like if I knew what happened to her or with her, then that would creep into the book in other ways, and I didn't want it to. So I really left it as an open question, you know.
Well, maybe one day that you'll write about her. No, I'm just kidding. Um, it's good. Um, because, and we had another person write in that like they wanted to know more about Suzanne Ledbetter. Like, what was your model for Suzanne?
Oh gosh. All I'm willing to say about this is that my model for Suzanne was someone very close and very near and dear to me, and also someone who in many ways was a puzzle to me. And of course, in the way that fiction works, you know, even a character who starts out based on a real person, you know, at some point pretty early in the process, they take on a life of their own and they become a truly fictional character. And you think that you imagine that people would not even recognize themselves, you know, even if they were the basis of a character. But Suzanne was based on someone who is very near and dear to me, and very much a puzzle to me in a lot of ways. And actually, that was the hardest chapter in the book for me to write.
Hmm.
In fact, so much so that I almost cut it. I mean, and when I say almost cut it, I mean we were talking about cutting that chapter like long into editing, because I could not get her right, and I didn't feel like I could really treat her with the complexity that she deserved, you know. And actually this is kind of a silly story, but the way I managed to make the leap was I was working on her and I was very frustrated, and I suddenly just realized, you know, all those casseroles she's making, they feed a lot of these characters. Like, it's easy to make fun of that and just kind of poo-poo it as, you know, some Southern lady, you know, who's making casseroles and dropping them all up and down the block, and who's, you know, an absolute hypocrite in her Christianity, which she is, you know. I mean, it's easy to like kind of walk, you know, kind of, you know, just sort of make fun of that and dismiss it. But those casseroles, you know, they feed like a shitload of my characters. And that was actually, believe it or not, that was actually like the moment where I was like, yeah, you know. And then I started to think about, you know, where is she from, right? Who were her people, you know, what was her family like, you know, what would make, you know, what would make Suzanne, you know, be this, you know, character who could so easily have kind of tipped into caricature. I mean, I still worry sometimes that I didn't, you know, get it quite right. So, but yeah, she's hard. She was hard for me, actually. So,
I think you pulled it off because she is like, she comes off at first like you think that she's just like kind of one dimensional,
mhm,
you know, placeholder for this type of person, but then she does have texture. She does have, you know, she does have an inner life, and
right.
so it's beautifully done. Um, so we have very short amount of time left. Is there anything else that you want to add or you want to um, express to to our audience?
You know, I want to say thank you again, you know, for all of your support and you know, for the book. I guess if there's anything that I would say, you know, this book is set in 1976, and in so many ways, Texas has changed. You know, in so many ways, it's better. You know, it's certainly a more diverse state. More than 50% of people in my hometown identify as Latinx, for example, now. But in my hometown, the power holders to this day continue to be white, the councilmen, and mostly men and women, the people who hold the money and the power in Odessa. The New York Times has got a beautiful series, a 4-part series right now called Odessa that is really, really worth listening to, for all of you if you're interested in that part of the world. And I guess, if you've been paying any attention, that Texas, in spite of, really having changed for the better, in a lot of ways, it hasn't changed at all, as we've seen very recently, with these storms. So I guess I would love to ask all of y'all to kind of hold Texas in your heart. I always want to make a real distinction between the people of Texas and the leadership of Texas, specifically that psychopath Greg Abbott and his little merry band of, grifters and thieves, and the people who live there. Texas has some of the harshest voting laws in the country. It has enormous amounts of voter disenfranchisement and a long, long, long history of voter suppression that exists to this day. So it's important not to confuse the people of Texas with the leadership there. And people are really suffering. People are really suffering in my hometown. The storms were just the last sort of they were just kind of the cherry on top of the shit sundae that has kind of been Texas's life for the last year, so I guess that's all. Just hold them in your heart, so
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Beth, because I think it's always easy for us to default, especially if we're in a rush, and it's just kind of like how our human brains work. We just like to fall back to these easy definitions and buckets that we hold in our head. And it's important to take that extra step to remember the distinction. Like these people, these other humans, our other brothers and sisters are suffering right now. And that, that it is the leadership. That's what we see in the news. It's not the people, and we should hold them.
Right. And, and Texas is, it's a minority rule state now. I mean, more than half of people in the state of Texas, do not identify as white, and of course, there's a ton of rural poverty out there, that affects, all kinds of folks. But so it's a complicated state and a beautiful state, but also a deeply troubled one, and much of that comes from the nature of power being hoarded, so.
Yeah, there's a lot of hoarding these days.
But other than that, on that happy note, I mean, also, I just want to say I'm so happy to be here, and thank you. I hope when all of this is over, well, first of all, I love San Francisco, and I have dear friends there, including one who has a baby I have not seen yet, because the baby was born last May. So I have a baby to see in the San Francisco area. But I hope I can stop in and sort of thank y'all in person. And, I'm so grateful for your support of the book. And it's really a lot to me. So.
It's really our pleasure. We were so proud to name this as our first edition pick. And for sure, come out to San Francisco. We would love to talk more books. You're always welcome in our store. We would love, you will have to carve out a couple hours because everyone's going to want to follow you.
Well, I would love to do that. I miss being in bookstores so much.
So we look forward to that visit, Beth. And so everybody get the paperbacks out. We have some book plates. I think there's the link on in the YouTube. I think someplace, I don't see the YouTube frame, but it's the link's there. You can go grab it, get one for your friends. It's a great, great, fantastic read, and you will be proud to be giving this to someone else and recommending it to read. So thank you all for tuning in and spending time with us. Thank you, Beth, for sharing all of your insight and wisdom. And it's just it's packed with so much love and care. I knew it from the moment I first read it, that it was 14 years of just amazing work. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Everyone be well. And thank you very much. So good night.
Good night.